Hey guys, tonight we drift back to the 6th century, where you, yes, you, are a humble Byzantine snail farmer. Picture this. The sky is still dark, the air carries that crisp pre-dawn chill, and somewhere in the distance, a donkey lets out a groan that perfectly matches your mood. You roll off your straw mattress, because, let's be honest, bed is too generous a word, and slip into your well-worn sandals. The ground is slightly damp from the evening dew, and your first thought isn't about coffee, because it hasn't been invented yet, but about the snails. Always the snails. Your day begins in the snail grove, a carefully shaded patch of land where your tiny, shelled livestock munch on lettuce you painstakingly grew just for them. These aren't just any snails. They're Roman snails, Helix pomatia, the prized delicacy of Constantinople's elite. And here's the kicker. If you mess this up, you don't just lose a paycheck. You might lose a finger to an irritated tax collector. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Where are you listening from tonight? Drop a comment with your location and local time. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The snails are already awake, or at least as awake as snails get. They glide lazily over dewy leaves, their little mouths working in slow motion. You kneel in the dirt, checking each one like a nervous parent. Too dry, they'll seal themselves shut. Too wet, they'll drown in their own slime. Historians still argue whether Byzantine snail farmers were the original helicopter parents. One of your snails, let's call him Theodosius the Slow, has ventured a little too far. You gently scoop him up, and he retracts into his shell with the dramatic flair of an emperor fleeing a barbarian invasion. You can't blame him. Life outside the grove is dangerous. Birds, rats, and worst of all, other farmers would love to make a meal of him. As the first rays of sunlight peek over the horizon, you hear the distant bells of a monastery. The monks are up, probably praying for patience. Meanwhile, you're praying your snails don't decide today is the day they all elope. The morning sun warms your back as you reach for your trusty wicker basket, its woven reeds softened from years of use. This, along with a handful of damp moss and an iron spoon worn smooth from scraping shells, makes up your entire snail farming toolkit. No fancy equipment here, just patience, observation, and the willingness to get your hands slimy before breakfast. You carefully lift Theodosius and place him in the basket, his shell making a faint tink against the woven reeds. One by one, you collect the other snails, each with their own quirks. There's Justinian, who always climbs to the highest leaf like he's surveying his empire, and Theodora, who somehow manages to look regal even while oozing across a rotten log. The damp moss lining the basket serves a crucial purpose. It keeps your precious cargo hydrated during transport. Too dry, and they'll retreat into their shells for days. Too wet, and you'll arrive at market with a basket of drowned gastropods. Historians still argue whether Byzantine snail farmers were the first true humidity control experts. Your iron spoon, worn smooth from years of gently prying stubborn snails off surfaces, doubles as a measuring tool. By holding it at arm's length, you can estimate if a snail has grown enough to fetch top price at market. The wealthy of Constantinople prefer their escargot plump, but not too large. Apparently, there's such a thing as too much snail. As you work, you notice a peculiar pattern in the slime trails left on broad grape leaves. Some claim these glistening paths can predict the weather, though you've yet to see any correlation between slime patterns and rain. Still, you make a mental note to check if the trails form any interesting shapes today. The local priest might pay a copper or two for what he calls divine snail signs. The rhythmic scraping of your spoon against the basket mixes with the distant crowing of roosters as you finish your morning harvest. Your stomach growls. Breakfast awaits, though it's hardly a feast. A hunk of coarse barley bread, some olives preserved in brine that's seen better days, and if you're lucky, a scrap of cheese traded from the shepherd down the road. But your snails, oh, they dine like emperors. You sprinkle the last of your precious lettuce leaves, grown in a shaded patch behind your hut, into their baskets. The greens cost you 3 copper coins at last market day, but fattened snails fetch double the price. As Theodosius begins his slow, methodical munching, you can't help but chuckle. This little mollusk eats better than half the villagers. While peasants subsist on gruel that could double as mortar, your snails enjoy fresh greens, crushed grape skins, and even the occasional sprinkle of powdered eggshell for stronger shells. Historians still argue whether Byzantine snail farmers invented the first premium organic diet. A rustling in the bushes interrupts your thoughts. It's old man Nicetas, your neighbor who keeps complaining your snails invade his herb garden. "They're at it again," he grumbles, pointing an accusing finger at a glistening trail leading toward his precious thyme. You sigh. This is the 3rd time this week. With practiced patience, you explain again that snails can't climb stone walls unless there's moisture for traction. Maybe if he stopped dumping his washing water along the base of his fence. As Nicetas stomps off muttering about snail conspiracies, you notice Justinian has escaped again. The adventurous gastropod is making a break for it, inching his way toward the olive tree at a pace that would make a glacier impatient. You scoop him up gently. "Not today, Your Highness," you murmur, placing him back with the others. Justinian immediately starts climbing the basket wall again. Some snails never learn. The morning sun grows warmer as you take your own meager breakfast under the shade of the fig tree. You chew your tough bread slowly, watching your slimy charges. In Constantinople, wealthy patricians will pay handsomely for these creatures, served sizzling in garlic and oil. You've never tasted them yourself. The idea seems vaguely cannibalistic after raising them from tiny hatchlings. Besides, you'd rather have the coins. The market bell tolls in the distance, its deep bronze clang echoing across the valley. Time to move. You carefully secure the woven lid over your basket, making sure it's tight enough to contain even Justinian's wanderlust, but loose enough to let air circulate. The journey to town is a slow one, partly because you're carrying precious cargo, partly because the road is more pothole than path. Every jolt makes you wince as tiny shells clink together like fragile coins. As you approach the market square, the scent of baking bread mixes with less pleasant aromas, animal dung, unwashed bodies, and the tang of fish left too long in the sun. You find your usual spot near the spice merchant, whose cinnamon and pepper help mask the earthy smell of your wares. Setting down your basket, you peel back the lid just enough to show your plumpest specimens without letting them make a break for it. Almost immediately, your first customer appears, a kitchen slave from one of the city's wealthy households. His nose wrinkles as he peers into the basket. "They're alive," he says, as if this is somehow surprising for snails. "Fresh as the morning dew," you reply, gently lifting Theodora to showcase her impressive shell swirls. These aren't your common garden pests, raised on grape leaves and spring water. You don't mention the grape leaves were actually scraps from the winemaker's refuse pile. The haggling begins. The slave offers half what you asked. You counter with a story about how these very snails were blessed by a passing monk. They weren't. He scoffs but doesn't walk away. A good sign. After 3 more rounds of negotiation involving dramatic sighs, hand gestures, and you pretending to consider feeding the snails to your non-existent chickens instead, you settle on a price. As the slave departs with his writhing purchase, a shadow falls across your stall. You look up to see the tax collector's assistant, stylus poised over his wax tablet. Your stomach sinks. Time to pay the snail tax. The tax collector's assistant taps his stylus against the wax tablet with practiced impatience. 12 snails, or the equivalent in copper, he declares, barely glancing at your carefully cultivated livestock. You open your mouth to protest. Last month it was only 10. But the withering look he gives you suggests this isn't open for debate. The Emperor's infrastructure projects won't fund themselves after all. You select your smallest specimens with practiced efficiency, though it pains you to hand over any of your hard-raised gastropods. The assistant barely checks them before dumping them unceremoniously into his official clay jar, already half full with other farmers' contributions. You watch as poor Justinian, who you'd secretly hoped might escape this fate, gets scooped up and disappears into the bureaucratic abyss. Historians still argue whether Byzantine tax collectors were more feared than barbarian invaders. As the assistant moves on to harass the olive vendor, you notice a familiar figure approaching. Lydia, the only other snail farmer in the region who doesn't look at you with either pity or disgust. She leans in conspiratorially. "Heard about the new edict?" she whispers. "They're requiring snail baskets to be officially measured and stamped next month. Another fee, of course." You groan quietly. Last year it was the shell thickness regulations. The year before, that was the mandatory snail census. The bureaucrats in Constantinople seem determined to make the simple act of farming mollusks as complicated as administering a province. Lydia shows you her latest innovation, a clever double-layered basket with a drainage system to keep the snails dry during sudden rains. You exchange tips about which wild greens make for the best feeding and commiserate about the rising cost of suitable containers. For a brief moment, surrounded by the chaos of the marketplace, you feel a sense of camaraderie that makes the backbreaking work almost worthwhile. Then a shriek cuts through the air. You both turn to see the spice merchant's wife flailing at her skirts. One of your escaped snails has apparently decided to explore her hemline. You quickly retrieve the adventurous gastropod before it can cause more havoc, offering profuse apologies. The merchant glares but doesn't demand compensation. Small mercies. As the sun begins its descent, you pack up your remaining stock. Not a terrible day's sales, despite the taxman's cut. You carefully count your coins, then recount them to be sure. Enough for a new cooking pot, maybe even some proper sandals if the cobbler is feeling generous. The walk home feels lighter than the morning's journey, though you can't shake the thought that somewhere in a government jar, Justinian is probably plotting his escape. The summer sun beats down like a hammer on an anvil, turning your usual snail grove into a cracked earth wasteland. You kneel in the dust, fingers probing the dry soil where just weeks ago dew would glisten on leaves each morning. Theodosius sits motionless, sealed tight in his shell. He hasn't moved in 3 days. You gently mist his resting place with precious water from your dwindling supply, watching for any sign of life. Drought transforms snail farming from a peaceful routine into a desperate battle. Each morning you trek farther to gather damp moss, your sandals kicking up puffs of pale dust. The village well's water level drops daily, and arguments break out between farmers and households over allocation. You take only what you absolutely need, just enough to keep your remaining snails from turning into little calcium carbonate coffins. Your neighbor Nikitas, usually so quick to complain about your snails, surprises you by leaving a clay pot of water at your door one evening. For the plants, he mutters when you thank him, though you both know the grapevines are beyond saving this season. You use half for your most vulnerable snails and return the rest with a handful of your last good lettuce. A silent trade between people who understand survival. The heat forces innovation. You dig shallow trenches in the shadiest part of your land, lining them with broken pottery shards to retain moisture. At night, when the temperature drops slightly, your snails emerge like tiny phantoms to drink from your carefully placed sponges. Historians still argue whether Byzantine farmers or their snails were more resilient during dry seasons. One particularly brutal afternoon, you discover a miracle, a cluster of snails sealed to the underside of a large flat stone, protected from the sun's wrath. Their shells feel cool to the touch, their epiphragms, that dried mucus door they create, still intact. You carefully move them to your best shaded trench, whispering promises of better days. As you work, a travelling monk pauses to watch your efforts. "You know," he says in that infuriatingly calm way holy men have, "in Egypt they say the snail's ability to survive drought proves the Creator's mercy." You resist the urge to point out that the Creator could simply send rain. Instead, you nod politely and continue misting your precious charges, each drop of water a silent prayer for relief. The oppressive heat finally breaks with a drizzle that turns into a steady rain, and suddenly your snails emerge like tiny miracles. Theodosius unseals himself first, his eye stalks stretching toward the moisture with what you swear is gratitude. Soon, the grove is alive with glistening trails, as your shelled charges make up for weeks of drought-induced fasting. As you check each snail for signs of dehydration damage, old widow Marcella hobbles into your grove clutching a clay jar. "For my joints," she says by way of greeting, thrusting the jar toward you. You peer inside to find a dubious-looking paste that smells vaguely of vinegar and something earthy. It takes you a moment to realize she's asking for snail slime, the latest miracle cure, sweeping through the village. You've heard the rumors, how snail mucus supposedly smooths wrinkles, cures baldness, and even mends broken bones if applied during a full moon. The local physician, who also happens to sell the jars, claims it works better than Egyptian crocodile dung poultices. You're skeptical, but Marcella offers 2 copper coins, so you carefully collect slime from a few particularly active snails using a clean seashell. The process is simpler than you'd imagined. Just let the snail crawl over the shell's concave surface, leaving behind its glistening trail. Theodosius seems almost amused by the process, his foot undulating with extra vigor as if showing off for his audience. Historians still argue whether Byzantine snail slime collectors were the earliest beauty influencers. As Marcella departs with her precious remedy, you notice young Theo lurking at the edge of your property. The boy has been fascinated by your snails since you let him hold one last spring. Today, he carries a small wooden box with air holes carefully carved in the sides. His own attempt at snail keeping, judging by the wilted lettuce leaf peeking out. You spend the next hour showing him how to properly moisten moss bedding and which plants make the safest food. His wide-eyed attention reminds you of your own beginnings, back when you thought snails only existed to ruin your mother's herb garden. By the time Theo leaves, carefully cradling his box containing 3 small snails you gifted him, you feel an odd sense of pride. The knowledge that this peculiar, peaceful livelihood might continue beyond your own tired hands. That evening, as you watch your snails bask in the lingering moisture, you idly wonder if Marcella's slime cure actually works. You rub a bit on your sun-weathered forearm just in case. It feels sticky and slightly ridiculous. But then again, so does farming snails for a living. The monastery bell echoes across the valley at an ungodly hour, which, you suppose, is rather the point for monks. You rub sleep from your eyes as you trudge up the steep path to St. Pantaleimons, your basket of plumpest snails swaying gently against your hip. The brothers may have dedicated their lives to spiritual matters, but even ascetics need protein, and your snails happen to be the only meat permitted during their current fasting period. Brother Matthias greets you at the kitchen gate, his tonsured head gleaming in the dawn light. "God's blessings upon you, snail bringer," he intones, then immediately ruins the solemnity by peering into your basket like a child at a sweet shop. "Ah, these look particularly virtuous today." You suppress a smile. The brothers have developed an entire theology around which snails are most suitable for holy consumption. The plump ones are humble in their abundance, while the smaller ones demonstrate modest restraint. Either way, they pay the same rate. As Matthias carefully transfers snails to the monastery's special terracotta breeding pots, each helpfully labelled with a saint's name, you notice young brother Lucas hovering nearby. The novice has been pestering you for weeks about snail farming techniques, much to his superior's annoyance. Today he seizes his chance when Matthias is called away, whispering, "Is it true they can sleep for 3 years?" You explain that while snails can estivate for extended periods, 3 years might be an exaggeration, though you've known a few particularly stubborn specimens that seemed determined to test the theory. Lucas nods earnestly, committing every word to memory. Historians still argue whether medieval monasteries were centres of spiritual enlightenment, or just really enthusiastic about invertebrate husbandry. Your transaction complete, Matthias surprises you by pressing a small clay jar into your hands. The monastery's famous honey, a luxury far beyond your usual means. "For your kindness in rising early," he says, though you suspect it's really payment for tolerating Lucas's endless questions. The honey will fetch a good price at market, but you find yourself thinking it might be nice to keep just a little for your barley porridge. As you descend the hill, the rising sun paints the valley gold. Behind you, the monks begin their chanting, the melodic Latin mixing with the waking sounds of birds and livestock. Somewhere in the monastery kitchen, your snails await their holy destiny. Blessed, boiled, and undoubtedly declared delicious by men who've sworn off worldly pleasures. The moon hangs heavy over your grove when the crunch of footsteps jolts you awake. You grab your walking stick, more a gnarled branch than a proper weapon, and creep toward the sound. There, hunched over your prized breeding basket, is a shadowy figure. As your eyes adjust, the moonlight reveals the unmistakable profile of Demetrios, that unscrupulous snail farmer from the next valley over. His hands freeze mid-theft when he sees you, a dozen of your fattest snails already secreted in his satchel. For a long moment, you both stand there, you clutching your pathetic stick, him caught like a child with his fingers in the honey pot. Then, with astonishing audacity, he has the nerve to say, "I was just checking their shell quality." You don't hit him, though the temptation is strong. Instead, you employ the most devastating weapon in a snail farmer's arsenal: shame. Loudly, very loudly. You list every snail he's taken by name. You may have embellished a few, describe the care you've given them, even throw in a dramatic bit about Theodora being your late mother's favourite. By the time you're done, Demetrios looks positively queasy, like he's been caught stealing sacred relics rather than mollusks. The confrontation ends with him returning every last snail, plus 2 of his own as compensation. You accept this snaily restitution with a stern warning that if he ever sets foot in your grove again, you'll report him to the bishop, not for theft, but for violating the unofficial snail farmer's code of honor. Historians still argue whether Byzantine snail disputes were settled more peacefully than land boundary quarrels. The next morning, you find an unexpected visitor at your gate. Lydia, clutching a basket of her finest specimens. "Heard about last night," she says by way of greeting. Without another word, she transfers half her snails to your baskets, a silent show of solidarity between fellow farmers. You try to refuse, but she insists with a wink. "Consider it an investment. If thieves target you, they're not targeting me." As you reorganize your grove that afternoon, you implement new security measures, thorny branches arranged around the perimeter, a string with dangling shells that will clatter if disturbed, and most importantly, you move Theodosius' basket right beside your sleeping mat. Let Demetrios try stealing him now. The whole affair leaves you oddly energized. There's something gratifying about defending your quiet, slimy livelihood, proof that even the most peaceful existence is worth protecting. That evening, as you watch Theodosius glide across his feeding stone with regal indifference, you raise a cup of watered wine in toast to snails, to honest farmers, and to thieves who get what's coming to them. The entire village smells of garlic and thyme today, a sure sign the feast of St. Tryphon has arrived. As the patron saint of gardeners, and by convenient extension, snail farmers, this is your one day each year where your peculiar profession earns something resembling respect. You've spent weeks preparing your finest specimens for the festival, fattening them on the last of your good lettuce, and even sprinkling them with precious powdered oregano to enhance their flavor. The town square buzzes with activity as you arrive, your basket carefully shrouded in damp cloth to keep its contents cool. The butcher's stall overflows with lamb cuts. The baker's ovens churn out loaves shaped like snails. A touching, if slightly unsettling tribute. And old Marcella has set up her snail slime remedy stand right beside the church steps. You take your assigned place at the farmer's table, nodding to Lydia across the way. Her snails look particularly plump this year. You make a mental note to ask her feeding secrets later. The highlight comes when Father Ioannis blesses the snails before cooking, sprinkling holy water over baskets, while reciting a special prayer that includes the memorable line, "May these humble creatures of the earth nourish us as your word nourishes our souls." Theodosius, ever the drama queen, chooses this moment to emerge fully from his shell and wave his eye stalks around as if personally accepting the blessing. The crowd chuckles. Your snails have become minor local celebrities. When the feast begins, you sample dishes you could never afford on an ordinary day. Snails stewed in wine, baked with cheese, even an extravagant version stuffed with minced fish and pine nuts that the mayor's wife claims is a Constantinopolitan delicacy. You chew slowly, trying not to think about which of your charges might be in each bite. Historians still argue whether medieval feast days celebrated food or simply provided an excuse to eat it. As twilight falls and the villagers drift toward the bonfire for storytelling, the mayor presents you with a small laurel wreath for exemplary snail cultivation. You wear it with ironic dignity, knowing full well it'll be forgotten by tomorrow, when everyone returns to thinking of you as just that odd mollusk farmer. But for tonight, as you sip honeyed wine and listen to tales of St. Tryphon's miracles, you allow yourself to feel like part of something larger than your quiet grove. The walk home is slower than usual, your belly full and head pleasantly light. Theodosius rides in his basket on your back, the only snail you couldn't bear to part with today. As you pass the church, you nod to the statue of St. Tryphon. Maybe next year you'll enter your snails in the size competition, or maybe you'll just enjoy another peaceful year of their slow, simple company. Either way, the festival reminds you that even the humblest creatures have their moment in the sun, or at least in the garlic butter. The first frost paints your grove in silver, each blade of grass stiff and glittering in the pale morning light. You exhale, watching your breath curl like smoke in the air. Winter has come, and with it the great snail hibernation. Your hands, already stiff from the cold, move carefully as you inspect each shell. Theodosius sealed himself in weeks ago, his epiphragm a perfect opaque seal across the shell's opening. Others followed suit, one by one, until your grove became a field of tiny biological time capsules waiting for spring. You've prepared their winter quarters with the same care a mother might ready a nursery. Shallow trenches lined with dry leaves, covered with woven reed mats to insulate against the worst cold. One by one, you transfer your dormant charges to their seasonal beds, murmuring quiet reassurances, though you know they can't hear you. Sleep well, Justinian. Sweet dreams, Theodora. It feels silly, this ritual of yours, but after so many years, you can't imagine doing it any other way. The village children, free from harvest chores, gather to watch the process with wide-eyed fascination. Little Eleni tugs your sleeve. Will they dream? She asks, with the solemn curiosity only a 6-year-old can muster. You consider telling her the truth, that snail brains are too simple for such things, but instead find yourself spinning a tale about snails dreaming of vast lettuce forests and dewdrop lakes. The children listen raptly, their frost-pinkened cheeks glowing in the winter sun. Historians still argue whether Byzantine snail hibernation practices inspired later traditions of winter storytelling. As you work, you notice old Nikitas observing from the edge of your property. He nods approvingly at your insulation methods. Even your harshest critic can't deny you know your craft. Later, he surprises you by delivering a sack of wool scraps from his sheep. For extra warmth, he grumbles, avoiding your eyes. You line the deepest hibernation trench with the gift, placing your most vulnerable snails, the young hatchlings and elderly specimens, in this prime real estate. That night, as you sit by your hearth rubbing liniment into your aching joints, you realize your grove isn't the only thing settling into winter dormancy. Your hands, once so deft at handling delicate shells, now fumble with simple tasks. The cold seeps into your bones in a way it never did in your youth. You glance at the small shrine in the corner, a crude clay snail figurine your daughter made before she married and moved to the city. Maybe this winter you'll finally take that apprentice the monks keep suggesting. Outside, the first snow begins to fall, blanketing the silent grove in white. Somewhere beneath that pristine cover, hundreds of snails wait patiently for warmer days. You bank the fire and pull your blanket tighter, thinking how strange it is to miss creatures who do little more than eat and sleep and leave glistening trails. Yet you do. Terribly. The village elders nod knowingly when you mention the snails' prolonged slumber this year. Deep sleep means hard frost coming, croaks old Giannis, tapping his walking stick for emphasis. You've heard these superstitions your whole life, how snail behavior predicts everything from harvest yields to marital fortunes. If they cluster on east-facing walls, rain is coming. If they climb high before midsummer, floods will follow. Never mind that last year your snails climbed the olive tree in June, and the only flood was your neighbor's overzealous irrigation ditch. Still, you play along when Marcella asks to inspect Theodosius's hibernation spot. She peers at the angle of his shell, the thickness of his epiphragm, and declares with absolute certainty that this means we'll have an early spring. You don't have the heart to tell her you moved him yesterday to better insulate the trench. Across the village, similar scenes unfold. Farmers checking pig spleens, shepherds studying wool thickness, and your snails unwittingly serving as meteorological consultants. The winter solstice brings the usual rituals. You join neighbors in burning dried vines to ensure fertility, though you sneak a few snail shells into the flames for good measure. When the village wise woman passes out protective amulets, you accept yours graciously. A clay disc stamped with spiral patterns suspiciously similar to snail shells. Even the priest's annual blessing of the animals includes a special prayer over your basket of hibernating juveniles, though he looks slightly perplexed while doing so. One particularly frigid morning, you discover young Theo waiting at your gate, hopping from foot to foot against the cold. Grandmother says snails cure warts, he announces, thrusting forward a finger with a suspicious bump. You explain, gently, that while snail slime has many purported uses, wart removal isn't one you'd recommend. Theo looks crestfallen, so you improvise. But if you place a pebble where a snail crosses it 3 times, then carry that pebble in your pocket. The boy's eyes light up as you spin this harmless fiction, already scanning the ground for suitable stones. That evening, as you check your hibernating charges, all still safely dormant, you reflect on how these superstitions persist. Maybe it's not about the snails at all, but about humans seeking patterns in an unpredictable world. Or maybe you chuckle to yourself as you tuck wool scraps around Theodosius Trench. People will believe anything if it's strange enough. Historians still argue whether medieval folk beliefs reflected deep ecological wisdom or just really creative storytelling. The first thunderstorm of the season rattles your shutters that night. According to village law, this means the snails will wake within 7 weeks. You mark the date on your calendar, not because you believe the old wives' tale, but because after 40 winters of farming, you've learned thunder or no thunder. The snails always emerge when they're good and ready. The tax collector arrives during the first spring drizzle, his wax tablet already crammed with calculations. This year, he carries an ominous new accessory, a set of brass balance scales dangling from his belt. Imperial decree, he announces without preamble. All snail taxes now payable by weight, not count. Your stomach sinks as you watch him extract Theodosius from his hibernation trench, still sealed in winter sleep, and place him on the scale. The brass plates tremble before settling, 3 coins worth, according to the collector's rapid calculations. One by one, he weighs your most valuable breeders while you stand helpless, mentally calculating how many weeks of market income this will cost. The new system proves as arbitrary as it is devastating. Larger snails, your most prized breeding stock, are taxed disproportionately. When you protest that dormant snails weigh less than active ones, the collector shrugs. Bring them awake next time. As if you can control the seasons themselves. By the time he departs, your coin purse is significantly lighter, and your grove missing several of its best specimens. Lydia finds you staring blankly at the ravaged hibernation trenches later. Without a word, she hands you a flask of something strong and herbal. "They took nearly half of mine too," she mutters after a long swig. The 2 of you sit in furious silence, watching the drizzle turn your carefully prepared trenches to mud. Historians still argue whether Byzantine tax policies stimulated economic growth or simply perfected creative oppression. That night, you take drastic measures. By candlelight, you begin excavating a hidden chamber beneath your storage hut, just large enough for your most valuable breeders. It's risky. Hiding taxable goods carries harsh penalties. But as you gently place Theodosius in his new underground refuge, you rationalize that this isn't evasion, just selective hibernation management. The next morning brings an unexpected reprieve. Young Theo arrives with his grandfather, the village headman. The old man examines the new tax scales with a practiced eye, then grunts. These haven't been calibrated since Julian's reign. He sends for the blacksmith, and after some adjustments involving lead weights and heated arguments, the scales are found to overmeasure by nearly a third. You don't get your snails back, but the collector is forced to return a handful of coins. As he stomps away, the headman murmurs, "Next year, store your big ones in Lydia's grove and hers in yours." Confuse the scales. You nod, filing away this wisdom alongside decades of snail-rearing knowledge. That evening, as you check on your hidden breeders, Theodosius finally stirs, his first movement since autumn. He extends his eye stalks sleepily, as if wondering why his winter nap was interrupted. You place a fresh grape leaf nearby and whisper, "Welcome back, old friend. You have no idea what you've slept through. Your hands betray you these days. Fingers that once deftly plucked snails from grapevines now fumble with simple knots." Theodosius sits heavy in your palm as you examine him, his shell more worn than you remember. The once vibrant stripes faded, like paint left in the sun. He's still your finest breeder, but you notice how he moves slower now, how he tires quicker. You find yourself talking to him more these days, sharing memories aloud, as if he might remember too. The great drought of 38, the year the monastery ordered double their usual amount. That time he escaped into the mayor's garden and caused a minor diplomatic incident. The village children have taken to helping with chores you once managed easily. Little Eleni, now nearly 12, shows remarkable patience for snail watching, while Theo, almost a man by village standards, handles the heavier lifting. You catch him sometimes, whispering to the snails as he works, using the same ridiculous names you coined decades ago. It stirs something in your chest, this unspoken passing of knowledge. One afternoon, as you teach Eleni how to spot prime breeding pairs, she asks the question you've been avoiding: will you farm snails forever? You look around at your grove, the carefully maintained trenches, the shade structures rebuilt each spring, the generations of snails that have lived and died under your care. The answer should be simple, but it sticks in your throat like dry bread. That night, you dream of your first snail, a tiny thing you found in your mother's garden as a child, its shell no larger than a pea. You'd kept it secretly in a clay cup, feeding it stolen lettuce scraps until your father found out and made you release it. 60 years later, you still remember how its tiny foot had glided across your fingertip, how impossibly foreign yet familiar it had felt. Morning finds you at the monastery gate, surprising even yourself. Brother Lucas, now Father Lucas, greets you with a knowing smile. Before you can speak, he says, "We've been expecting you." It seems young Theo has been pestering them about establishing a monastic snailery, citing your methods as gospel. The irony isn't lost on you. Your life's work may outlive you in the most unexpected way. As you walk home, Theodosius riding in your pocket as he often does these days, you realize something surprising. You're not sad. The grove will continue. Your snails will thrive. And you'll finally have time to sit in the shade and watch the world move at a snail's pace. The seasons turn, as they always do. Your grove thrives under Theo and Eleni's care, though you still visit daily, if only to watch the morning light filter through the grape leaves and dapple the shells below. Theodosius, ancient by snail standards, spends his days basking on a special stone near your sitting spot, emerging only for the juiciest lettuce or when children come to hear your stories. Today, you bring a gift, a clay tablet you've painstakingly inscribed with everything worth knowing about snail farming. The best moss sources, which wild greens prevent shell deformities, even that trick with the powdered eggshells. Theo accepts it with solemn reverence, while Eleni immediately begins arguing about feeding schedules. You lean back, letting their voices wash over you as Theodosius makes his glacial way across your sandal. The monks have started their own snailery, of course. Father Lucas sends regular updates, how their snails are particularly pious, how they've developed a special blessing for new hatchlings. You smile at each report, imagining generations of holy mollusks fattening in monastery gardens. As evening falls, you make your rounds one last time. The trenches are properly moist, the breeding baskets secure against predators. Theodosius has retreated into his shell for the night, his familiar striped spiral just visible in the fading light. You touch it gently, feeling the ridges worn smooth by time and weather, like the handle of your favorite spoon. The walk home is slower these days, but pleasant. The air carries the scent of time and damp earth, the sounds of the village settling into night. Somewhere, a mother calls her children inside. Somewhere, a monk chants evening prayers. And somewhere in your grove, a new generation of snails begins its silent, glistening journey across the leaves. Wind down. And so we leave you here, in this quiet moment between day and night, between waking and dreaming. The story of the Byzantine snail farmer fades like sunlight from a garden wall, like the last glimmer of a snail's trail as it dries in the evening air. Perhaps tonight you'll dream of shaded groves and patient hands, of small lives lived slowly and well. Or perhaps you'll simply drift, carried on the whisper of leaves, on the memory of shells glinting like scattered coins in the grass. However you rest, know this: the world continues at its own pace, as it always has. The snails will glide, the seasons will turn, and somewhere, right now, someone is discovering the quiet wonder of watching a tiny creature make its patient way through the world. Breathe deep. Let go. The night is gentle, and dawn will come when it's ready. Sweet dreams.